At dawn on the 5th of November, 1854, Russian columns climbed through thick fog towards the British right flank above Inkerman, east of Sevastopol. The men they were about to hit had spent weeks in the mud and cold of the Crimean siege lines, guarding broken ridges, ravines and batteries, while the Russian fortress behind them refused to fall. Many British soldiers could not see more than a few yards ahead. Pickets heard movement before they could judge its size. Officers heard firing before they knew which part of the line was being attacked. The Russian plan was simple and dangerous. Use the fog, smash the exposed British position before French help could arrive, and break the Allied siege of Sevastopol before winter made the war even worse. Prince Menshikoff's army had numbers, guns, and the advantage of surprise. The British had tired infantry, scattered units, and a battlefield that disappeared into mist the moment command mattered most. Within minutes, Inkerman stopped being a battle controlled neatly by generals. Men fought in gullies, behind stone walls, around the Sandbag Battery, near the barrier on the post road, and on ridges where no one could see the whole fight. Russian columns kept coming. British units were thrown in wherever the line was tearing. So how did a tired British force survive a Russian assault in a fog so thick that the battle almost broke into pieces? The answer begins with the siege of Sevastopol. In September 1854, British, French and Ottoman forces landed in the Crimea to strike at Russia's great naval base on the Black Sea. Sevastopol was not just another port, it was the heart of Russian power in the region, a fortress city whose guns and fleet threatened Ottoman influence and challenged the balance of power that Britain and France wanted to preserve. The Allies defeated the Russians at the Alma on the 20th of September, then moved south towards Sevastopol. A quick assault might have ended the campaign early, but hesitation, disagreement, and the strength of the Russian defenses pushed the Allies into a formal siege. Trenches were opened, batteries were built. Supplies had to move from Balaclava across difficult roads. The army that had arrived expecting a sharp campaign began to learn that Crimea could punish men without a battle. Then came Balaclava on the 25th of October. The Russians tried to disrupt the British supply base, and the day produced some of the most famous images of the war. The thin red line, the charge of the heavy brigade, and the disaster of the light brigade. The Russians did not capture Balaclava, but they showed that the Allied siege lines were vulnerable. They also gained positions from which they could threaten the only reliable British supply route. Inkerman came less than 2 weeks later, not as an isolated attack, but as another attempt to crack the siege before it hardened. By early November, the British right flank near Inkerman was held by Sir de Lacy Evans's 2nd Division, though Evans himself was ill, leaving Brigadier John Pennefather as the acting commander on the ground. This mattered more than anyone knew. Pennefather was aggressive, practical, and willing to send small bodies of men forward before the Russians could organize the fight on their own terms. His division's camp lay on Home Ridge, near the post road that crossed the heights and descended towards Inkerman Bridge. Below and around it were ravines, slopes, and broken ground that could hide troops until they were dangerously close. The key points would soon become names repeated in battlefield accounts: Home Ridge, Fore Ridge, the Careenage Ravine, the Barrier, and the Sandbag Battery. The barrier was a rough wall across the post road. The Sandbag Battery was an unfinished or abandoned battery position overlooking part of the approach. None of these places looked grand on a map. In the fog, they became anchors of survival. Before the fog closes over the battlefield, write in the comments where you are watching from. Inkerman was fought in the Crimea, but its story belongs to anyone who wants to understand how soldiers survive when commanders lose sight of the battle. The Russian attack began before dawn. General Soimonov led troops from the Sevastopol garrison, while General Pavlov advanced from the field army across the Chernaya. General Dannenberg was expected to take overall command once the columns combined. The numbers favored the Russians heavily. Their attacking force included tens of thousands of infantry and many guns, while the first British troops struck on the ridge were only a small part of the Allied army. The night had been wet, and the morning was thick with fog. That helped the Russians approach, but it also complicated their own movements. Soimonov's column moved through difficult ground, and the narrow approaches prevented the Russians from deploying their numbers cleanly. Dense columns are frightening when they can strike with weight, but on broken slopes in fog they can also become compressed targets. The British could not always see far, but when Russian formations appeared, they were often close, dense, and vulnerable to controlled fire. The first serious fighting erupted among the pickets. These forward detachments did something vital. They did not stop the Russian army, but they warned the British line that this was not a minor alarm. Shots cracked out of the mist. Men fell back fighting. Reports reached Pennefather, and he responded in a way that shaped the whole morning. Instead of waiting passively on the ridge, he pushed troops forward into the fog to meet the attack before it could fully form. This was risky. Sending small units into mist against a much larger enemy could have ended in disaster. Yet at Inkerman, it prevented the Russians from enjoying the full advantage of surprise. The British did not sit still and wait to be rolled up. They moved towards the noise, sometimes in companies, sometimes in mixed groups, sometimes with men from different regiments fighting side by side because the fog had already broken normal order. The Russian heavy guns on Shell Hill opened fire onto the British positions and camp. The bombardment could have been devastating if the troops had remained exposed on the crest, but many had already moved forward. Camp equipment, tents, and positions were smashed, yet the infantry was not simply waiting to be crushed. The battle was becoming a collision of small fights before the Russians had secured the decisive blow they wanted. One Russian column advanced against the British left. A wing of the 49th Regiment met it with a volley and then charged with the bayonet, driving the attackers back down the slope. This was the pattern Inkerman would repeat again and again. Russian numbers pushed forward. British infantry fired fast and hard, then counterattacked before the enemy could settle. These were not elegant maneuvers. They were violent corrections made in minutes. Soimonov himself led another attack, larger and more determined. Troops from the Light Division, including men of the 77th and 88th, came up into the fight, while British guns were pushed into action wherever they could be useful. At one point, Russian troops captured British guns, but British infantry charged and recovered them. The fighting around those guns was close, confused, and costly. Soimonov was killed, and General Buller was wounded. The Russian assault did not collapse at once, but the loss of a commander in such fog added to the confusion. The first phase had failed to break the British, but the battle was far from over. Pavlov's column was now entering the fight from across the Chernaya, and the pressure shifted towards the barrier, the Sandbag Battery, and the crest of the ridge. The Russians still had strength. They still had mass. They still had the chance to break through if one British position gave way at the wrong moment. Inkerman became the soldiers' battle because command could not reach every place where decisions had to be made. The fog hid units from their commanders. The broken ground cut the battlefield into fragments. A regiment might be fighting for its life, while another only a short distance away could not see exactly what was happening. Men advanced because they heard firing. Officers gathered whatever soldiers were nearest and led them towards the pressure. Units lost their neat identity and formed temporary fighting groups because survival mattered more than parade ground order. The barrier became one of the most bitterly contested points. Russian troops pressed along the post road, and the British had to hold a feature that looked crude but mattered enormously. If the Russians forced the road and gained the crest behind it, they could split the defense and threaten the British position from within. Men of the 30th Regiment and other units fought there under heavy pressure. At times the position was lost or nearly lost, then retaken by troops thrown forward by Pennefather and other commanders. The Sandbag Battery saw another vicious struggle. Brigadier Adams and British units, supported by guards arriving from their camp, fought against far larger Russian attacks. The ground changed hands in charges and countercharges. Men fired until the enemy came too close, then used the bayonet, rifle butt, and whatever strength remained. The Guards Brigade suffered heavily. Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, and Scots Fusilier Guards were pulled into a battle that did not allow them the comfort of a clean line or a clear view. This is the heart of Inkerman. Britain survived because enough small groups did not break. A few hundred men at a barrier held long enough for others to arrive. A regiment fired into a column before it could deploy. Guardsmen retook ground that had already been lost. Officers led mixed groups because the fog had made perfect formation impossible. The plan did not save the army. The men kept saving the plan after it had started to fail. If you enjoy stories where military history comes down to terrain, confusion, discipline, and men holding a line under impossible pressure, subscribe to the channel. And write in the comments where you are watching from, because Inkerman was fought in the fog, but its story still reaches far beyond the Crimea. General Sir George Cathcart and the 4th Division entered the battle as the crisis deepened. Cathcart was brave and energetic, but the ground and fog punished initiative as easily as caution. He led men into a flank movement that at first seemed to offer a chance to strike the Russians hard. Then the situation turned. Russian troops appeared from unexpected ground. Cathcart's force was taken in the rear, and Cathcart himself was killed. His death showed how dangerous Inkerman had become for commanders who tried to make sense of a battlefield that refused to stay visible. The British line still held, but it was being stretched by exhaustion and numbers. The Russians reached the crest in places. They pushed hard around the ravines and road. Each renewed attack forced British regiments to respond with whatever men could be found. The fight became less about one continuous line and more about a chain of local survivals. If one link failed, the Russians might pour through. French support became increasingly important as the day went on. General Bosquet and French troops moved to assist the British, and their arrival helped stabilize the battle at moments when the British were close to being overwhelmed. This does not weaken the British story. It makes it more honest. The British infantry bore much of the early shock in the fog, but Inkerman was an Allied battle. French reinforcements helped turn survival into victory. The Russians fought with determination. Their soldiers climbed steep, wet slopes under fire, attacked positions that had already repulsed earlier columns, and returned again after heavy losses. They were not defeated because they lacked courage. They were defeated because the fog, the ground, the loss of commanders, the compression of their columns, and the stubbornness of British and French infantry prevented their numbers from becoming a clean breakthrough. By midday, the Russian attack had lost much of its original force, though fighting continued for hours. The British were exhausted, but they had not been driven from the heights. The French were now firmly involved. Russian artillery still punished the ridge from Shell Hill, and Lord Raglan ordered heavier British guns from the siege park to be brought up. Teams of gunners manhandled large 18-pounder guns into position on Home Ridge. When they opened fire, supported by other batteries and long-range rifle fire against Russian crews, the pressure from Shell Hill began to weaken. That detail matters because Inkerman is often remembered only as infantry heroism. It was that, but it was not only that. artillery, terrain, timing, and French support all helped decide the day. The infantry held long enough for these other pieces to matter. Had they broken in the first hours, no later gun, reinforcement, or counterstroke could have saved the position. The soldiers bought the commanders time to recover the battle. By afternoon, the Russian assault had spent itself. There was no dramatic single moment when the whole Russian army suddenly turned and ran. The attack faded under the weight of losses, failed assaults, broken organization, and the arrival of Allied strength. The battlefield was left covered with dead and wounded around the Sandbag Battery, the barrier, and the slopes where men had fought in the fog without ever seeing the whole battle. The cost was severe. The British suffered around 2,500 casualties, the French around 1,700 according to National Army Museum's summary, and Russian losses were around 12,000. Other accounts vary in exact numbers, but none make the battle anything less than brutal. The Victoria Cross would later be awarded retrospectively to many men for acts of gallantry connected with Inkerman, a sign of how deeply the battle entered British military memory. Yet the victory did not end the war. That is the darker truth. Inkerman stopped the Russians from breaking the Allied siege lines, but it also convinced the Allies that Sevastopol would not be taken easily. The siege dragged on. Winter arrived. Supply failures, disease, cold, and administrative failure punished the British Army in ways that became infamous at home. A storm on the 14th of November wrecked ships and destroyed supplies that the army badly needed. Inkerman was a battlefield victory, but it led into one of the hardest winters British soldiers would endure in the 19th century. That is why Inkerman should not be remembered as a clean triumph. It was a survival victory. The Russians failed to break the line, but the British and French paid heavily to hold it. The courage of the infantry did not solve the misery of the campaign. It prevented one disaster and delivered the army into another kind of suffering. That makes the battle more powerful, not less, because real endurance is rarely followed by instant reward. The British heroism at Inkerman was not the heroism of a perfect plan. It was Pennefather sending men forward into fog because waiting might be fatal. It was pickets firing early enough to warn the ridge. It was the 49th charging before a Russian column could settle. It was guardsmen fighting around the Sandbag Battery. It was mixed groups of soldiers from different regiments forming around any officer who could lead them. It was wounded men staying in the line because the line needed them. It was French troops arriving in time to help turn a desperate defense into an Allied victory. Inkerman still matters because it shows what happens when a battle stops obeying the map. Generals can plan routes, objectives, and timings, but fog can erase distances, ravines can split formations, and a sudden assault can turn neat orders into local chaos. In that moment, the army survives only if enough men understand the simplest task left to them: hold the ground in front of you. The Russians used the fog to reach the British line. The British used discipline to stop the fog from becoming defeat. By the end of the day, the heights of Inkerman remained in Allied hands, Sevastopol remained under siege, and the Russian attempt to break the line had failed. If this story changed the way you see the Crimean War, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which battle, commander, or regiment before 1900 we should break down next.